The train from Brussels carried him into a landscape of grays. Vincent van Gogh watched through the grimy window as the world outside bled of color, the green fields surrendering to heaps of black slag and skeletal pithead towers. The Bornage, Belgium's coal country, was a scar on the earth, and the 25-year-old Dutchman, clutching a worn Bible, believed he was being sent to heal it. He had been dismissed from his position as an art dealer in London for being too argumentative, too fervent, and had failed as a teacher and a bookseller. Now, the Evangelical Committee had granted him a 6-month trial as a lay preacher. Here, among the most wretched, he would finally find his purpose, or so his desperate heart insisted. He rented a meager hut in the mining village of Woesmaes, a single room with a dirt floor. The miners and their families lived in rows of identical soot-stained cottages, their lives measured in shifts and coughs. Vincent immediately gave away his spare clothes, his bed, and most of his food. He slept on straw. He washed his own linen in a bucket, his hands growing raw. He believed that to preach Christ's love, he must live as the poorest among them. He descended into the Marcasse mine, a terrifying descent into a hot, dripping, pitch-black labyrinth where men and boys hacked at the coal face by the guttering light of their lamps. The experience was not one of fear for himself, but of a crushing, sacred awe for their daily crucifixion. He began to hold Bible readings in a makeshift chapel, his voice trembling with emotion. But the gaunt faces that looked back at him were hollowed by exhaustion, their eyes reflecting a suffering his tidy theological phrases could not touch. They needed bread, not scripture. Frustrated, he took to the streets, tending to the injured after pit collapses, bandaging wounds with strips torn from his own shirt. He sketched incessantly on scraps of paper, the bent backs of women hauling coal sacks, the weary trudge of men emerging from the shaft, their features etched with grime and resignation. The lines of his pencil were urgent, seeking the truth in the slope of a shoulder, the deep-set eyes. In these crude drawings, he felt a communion he never found in his sermons. The church committee was appalled. They received reports of a preacher who reeked of poverty, who neglected his clerical duties for drawing and nursing, who had become a ragged spectacle. They visited and found him emaciated, living in squalor they deemed self-imposed and disgraceful. His radical imitation of Christ was an embarrassment, a fanaticism that undermined the dignity of their mission. His trial period was not renewed. The dismissal letter was cold and final. The purpose he had clutched at was ripped away, leaving a void more profound than the mine's deepest shaft. Alone in his hut, the winter wind whistling through the cracks, Vincent stared at his pile of drawings. The faces of the miners looked back, a silent, judging congregation. He had failed again. A profound despair, blacker than coal dust, settled into his bones. He had nothing to give, nowhere to go. In a final, feeble act of connection, he lit a stub of a candle, took a sheet of paper, and began a letter to his younger brother Theo, the one constant in his turbulent life. The words spilled out in a torrent of anguish, confessions of failure, of being a burden, of a soul adrift. He wrote of the miners, of their silent endurance, and of his own terrifying certainty that he was meant for something, a purpose that remained just beyond the guttering candlelight, forever out of reach. The letter ended not with a plea, but with a sigh of hopelessness that soaked into the paper, a stark contrast to the vigorous, living lines of the sketches scattered around him on the dirt floor. The parsonage in Noonan was a world of quiet propriety, a place of polished floors and his father's stern sermons. To Vincent, returning home at 31, defeated and rootless, it felt like a cage lined with velvet. The Borenage's black dust still felt ground into his pores, a gritty truth that clashed with the domestic order. He needed a space of his own, not a bedroom in his parents' house, but a workshop that matched the raw subjects calling to him. In a vacant laundry room at the back of the sexton's house, he found it. He modeled it after the peasant huts he admired, dark, cramped, earthen. He brought in a few pieces of crude furniture, a stove that smoked, and hung his own studies of weavers on the walls. This was not a studio for creating pretty pictures. It was a burrow for unearthing truth. His subjects were the local peasants, men and women, whose bodies were maps of labor. He drew them digging potatoes, planting beets, weaving cloth in dim cottages. He sought not the pastoral ideal of city painters, but the unromanticized reality, the gnarled hands like knotted roots, the bowed spines that seemed permanently shaped by the weight of the soil, the faces carved by wind and worry into landscapes as expressive as any he had seen in the mines. He worked with a furious concentration, his pencil capturing the essential lines of strain and survival. He paid his models in tobacco or a few coins, and they sat for him in patient, silent endurance, their stillness itself a form of toil. Among the neighboring families were the Begemans. Their daughter Margot was a woman in her 40s, quiet and melancholic, who seemed to exist in the shadow of her more robust siblings. She began to visit Vincent's studio, drawn by the intensity of his work, seeing in his own isolation a reflection of her own. A fragile bond formed. She brought him small comforts, a warmer scarf, a plate of food more substantial than the bread and cheese he often forgot to eat. In her, Vincent found a hesitant companionship, a listener for his fervent theories about art and life. For Margot, whose existence had been one of quiet duty and fading prospects, Vincent's passionate, unkempt presence was a lightning bolt. He spoke to her of color and character, of the divine in a potato field, and she mistook his artistic fervor for personal affection. Their relationship deepened into a fraught, doomed affair. It was a connection born of loneliness more than love, a mutual grasping for solace in the rigid, small-minded village. When their families discovered the liaison, the scandal was immediate and severe. The Begemans were horrified, his own parents mortified. Margot, caught between her desperate feelings and the crushing weight of familial disapproval, collapsed under the strain. One afternoon she was found in a field having swallowed strychnine in a violent attempt to end her life. She did not die, but the act was a cataclysm. The aftermath was a desolate silence. Margot was sent away to recover, a broken woman. Vincent was left alone in his studio, the village's condemnation now a palpable wall around him. The incident confirmed every suspicion about his unsuitability, his dangerous otherness. The isolation he had cultivated for his art now became a prison of social exile. He threw himself back into his drawings with a manic, despairing energy, the faces of the peasants before him seeming to hold a deeper, more resigned sorrow than before. Their silent endurance was no longer just a subject to study. It was a mirror. In the smoky gloom of his hut-like studio, the only sounds were the scratch of his charcoal and the hollow echo of his own footsteps. A man now completely untethered, seeking truth in dirt and shadow, while the real world receded into a blur of pain and reproach. The argument with Van Rappert arrived like a winter gust, chilling the already tense air of the studio. Vincent's friend, a painter of more refined sensibilities, had traveled from Brussels to see the progress on the large canvas that now dominated the cramped space. Vincent called it the Potato Eaters. He had been preparing for months, drawing countless studies of the de Groot family, their coarse features, their hands like tangled wood, the dim interior of their cottage. The composition was set. 5 figures gathered around a meager meal, their faces illuminated by a single overhead lamp. The room a cavern of browns and somber grays. Van Rappard studied it in silence for a long moment, and his critique, when it came, was polite but firm. The drawing was clumsy, the perspective awkward, the figures crude and ugly. He suggested more study, more finesse, a touch of grace. Vincent's reaction was immediate and volcanic. He defended not his technique, but his vision. This was not about beauty, he insisted with a trembling intensity. It was about truth. He wanted to show that these peasants, with their hard, honest labor, had earned their food by the rough grace of their own hands. The painting must smell of bacon, smoke, and potato steam. The clumsy drawing was intentional, a rejection of academic slickness to convey the raw, unpolished reality of their existence. He spoke of Millet, of the sacredness of toil. Van Rappard, baffled by this defiance of artistic convention, left soon after. Their friendship fractured. Vincent stood before the canvas, alone again, but burning with a defiant certainty. The world wanted pretty lies. He would give them an honest ugliness that bordered on the holy. He worked now in a feverish state, a man possessed. The studio became a cell of obsession. He mixed his paints thickly, applying them with a heavy, deliberate hand, sculpting the faces with pigment. The lamp's glow became a halo of dirty yellow, casting deep, dramatic shadows that pooled in the eye sockets and the folds of worn clothing. He painted the potatoes as earthy clods, the coffee pot a humble vessel. Every brushstroke was an act of solidarity, a communion. He forgot to eat, slept fitfully on his cot, his dreams filled with the muted colors of the peat soil. When he finally laid down his brushes, he was hollow-eyed and trembling, the painting complete. He saw in it everything he had intended: the dignity of endurance, the solemn ritual of a shared meal after a long day's labor. He believed for a fleeting moment that he had finally captured the soul of a people. The criticism that followed was universal and blunt. When he sent a lithograph of the work to acquaintances, the responses were dismissive or mocking. The figures were grotesque, the colors muddy, the technique amateurish. Even his former colleagues from his art-dealing days wrote to express their disappointment. One called it a vulgar caricature. The painting into which he had poured his deepest convictions about art and humanity was met with a wall of incomprehension. The rejection was not merely of a painting, but of his entire philosophy, his hard-won belief that truth trumped technique. The impact was a cold, solidifying certainty. The art world, with its salons and its critics, its love of pleasing surfaces, would never understand him. This conviction settled in his chest like a stone. He did not feel anger so much as a profound, isolating clarity. He packed the potato eaters away, not in defeat, but in a grim resolve. If they wanted pretty pictures, let them have them. He would walk his own path, even if it led through endless fields of rough earth and into the faces of those who lived by it. The rejection severed his last fragile hope of conventional acceptance. From that moment in the Noonan studio, surrounded by the smell of oil and peat smoke, Vincent van Gogh ceased to paint for an audience that did not exist. He painted only for the truth as he saw it, a solitary pilgrim in a world determined to see nothing but his crude mistakes, blind to the raw, aching life he had laid bare upon the canvas. Paris was a cacophony of light after the somber peat bogs of Noonan. To Vincent, arriving at his brother Theo's small apartment on the Rue Lepic, the city felt like a physical blow, a dazzling, disorienting assault of noise, movement, and color. Theo, ever patient, had offered sanctuary, a place to live and work, amidst the modern art he sold. The apartment walls, once Vincent's own, were now lined, not with his dark studies of peasants, but with canvases that seemed to vibrate. Landscapes dappled with pure, unmixed color, scenes of bourgeois leisure painted with swift, visible brushstrokes. These were the Impressionists, Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, and their work spoke a visual language Vincent had never encountered. It was a language of atmosphere and instant, of light fractured into 1,000 prismatic shards. Alongside them hung Japanese woodblock prints, flattened perspectives, bold outlines, and areas of startling, unmodulated color. They depicted waterfalls, geishas, and blossoming branches with a decorative clarity that felt both ancient and radically new. Vincent's initial response was a frantic, hungry assimilation. He set up his easel in a corner of the apartment, the smell of turpentine mingling with the coal smoke from the stove. He began to experiment, forcing his own palate to lighten. The oppressive embers and ochres of the potato eaters were banished. He bought tubes of cobalt blue, vermilion, chrome yellow. He painted still lifes of flowers, not as botanical studies, but as explosions of hue. A bouquet of zinnias became a crackling fire of reds and oranges. He painted views from his window, the rooftops of Montmartre, rendered in staccato dashes of lavender and slate gray under a sky of milky cerulean. He copied the Japanese prints meticulously, learning their economy of line, their daring compositions. For a time there was a feverish joy in this liberation, a sense of shedding a heavy, dark skin. But the city's relentless pace soon began to erode that joy. The bohemian life Theo introduced him to. The cafés of Montmartre, like the Café du Tambourin and the Café de la Nouvelle Athènes, overwhelmed his nervous temperament. He found himself surrounded by painters, critics, and poets, all talking at once, debating technique, politics, and aesthetics with a glib, combative energy. Vincent, earnest and intense, lacked their conversational armor. His contributions were not witty repartee, but fervent, impassioned declarations about the spiritual role of color or the moral integrity of the peasant. He drank absinthe to steady his nerves, the bitter green, liquid fueling his arguments but blurring the already strident edges of the world. He clashed fiercely with anyone who dismissed the work he admired, his voice rising, his gestures becoming wild. The camaraderie he observed felt like a performance, a chatter that masked a deeper indifference. A profound alienation set in, a loneliness more acute amidst the crowd than it had ever been in the empty fields of Brabant. In the smoke-hazed cafes, surrounded by laughter and debate, Vincent felt utterly alone. The light he had come to Paris to find was everywhere, glinting off the Seine, filtering through the chestnut trees, glowing in the wine glasses. But it felt transient, elusive, a spectacle he could observe, but never truly inhabit. His experiments with color began to feel like mere exercises, lacking the foundational gravity of his work in Noonan. The gaunt, meaningful faces of the miners and peasants were replaced by the quick, anonymous bustle of boulevardier. He missed the silence, the slow, patient growth of things, the connection to soil and sky. The vortex of Paris, its artistic ferment, its social demands, its sheer speed, was draining him, leaving him agitated and rootless. He painted the windmills of Montmartre, but they seemed like relics. He painted self-portraits, scrutinizing his own face in the mirror, seeing the red hair and beard, framing eyes that grew increasingly haunted, the palette in his hand a shield against a world he could not navigate. The vibrant colors on his canvas became a desperate assertion of life, against a creeping internal gray. He wrote to old friends like Van Rappert, letters full of descriptions of new techniques, but also of a deep-seated unease. He longed for a different light, not the diffused, shifting light of the north, but hammer blow of sun, a clarity so intense it would burn away all ambiguity and doubt. Paris had given him a new vocabulary of color, but it had stolen his peace. In the small hours after the cafes had emptied and Theo slept, Vincent would stare at his latest canvas, the brilliant pigments seeming to swim before his tired eyes, and feel a desperate aching pull southward toward a solitude drenched in a purer, fiercer radiance. The train south was a passage into a new element. After the gray vortex of Paris, the Provençal light that flooded the carriage window near Arles was not merely illumination but a physical presence, a thick liquid gold that pooled in the valleys and gilded the rows of cypress trees standing like sentinels. Vincent stepped onto the platform, squinting against the February glare, and felt something within him, long clenched, begin to unfurl. Here was the clarity he had craved, a sun that did not suggest but declared, casting shadows so sharp they seemed cut from black paper. He took a room at the Café de la Gare, but his eyes were already searching for a permanent foothold in this radiant world. He found it on the Place Lamartine, a two-story building with walls the color of fresh butter and a green-painted door. The locals called it the Yellow House. It was modest, slightly dilapidated, with shutters hanging askew, but to Vincent it was a sanctuary and a manifesto. He rented the right wing, 4 empty rooms awaiting purpose. The act of securing a key was an act of faith. For the first time in his 35 years he would have a home of his own, a studio not borrowed or makeshift, but a dedicated space where he could build something. He wrote to Theo, his letters ecstatic, ink splattering with excitement. He described the light, the low cost of living, and his grand, fragile dream. The Yellow House would become a studio of the South, a communal haven where artists like Gogh and Bernard and others could live and work together, freed from financial worry, united in a search for a new vital art under the midi sun. That spring and summer, Arles became his furnace. He worked with a manic, joyous energy, rising at dawn to capture the orchards in blossom. The subject was not new, but the treatment was transformed. Where his Parisian flowers had been experiments in color, these almond and peach branches against a cerulean sky were hymns. He painted them with a thick, swirling impasto, the blossoms not delicate, but exuberant bursts of white and pink, the trunks solid and twisting with life. He carried his easel into the fields, painting the sower striding across a crimson earth under a citron sun, the very air vibrating with fecundity. The wheat, still green, swayed in rhythms that began to echo in his brushstrokes, but the heart of his new domain was the house itself. He spent precious francs sent by Theo on simple furniture, a wooden bed, 2 chairs, a table. He painted his own bedroom with a childlike, profound simplicity, the bed sturdy and inviting, the walls a pale violet, the floor red tiles, the window shuttered against the afternoon heat. It was a portrait of peace, a room awaiting a guest, a sanctuary within a sanctuary. Then he turned to the sunflowers. He bought armfuls of them, their heavy heads already drooping in the market heat, and arranged them in a simple jug. He painted them not as still life, but as portraiture, capturing each stage of their brief, glorious life. The vibrant yellow heads in full blaze, the seeds beginning to form, the petals curling in decay. He painted them against backgrounds of royal blue, making the yellow sing a chromatic note so pure it seemed to generate its own light. These were not decorations. They were his welcoming committee, meant to adorn Gogh's room, a promise of the vibrant fellowship to come. His letters to Theo during this period were a torrent of plans and gratitude. He sketched diagrams of the rooms, calculated costs for beds and bedding, debated which walls should hold which paintings. He was the curator, architect, and visionary of his own fragile utopia. In the evenings, exhausted and sun-drunk, he would sit in the still bare yellow house, the walls slowly filling with his own canvases, the orchards, the sower, the sunflowers, his bedroom. For a few fleeting months, a miraculous alignment occurred. His art, his environment, and his mood achieved a precarious harmony. The loneliness that had trailed him from the Bornage to Paris receded, not gone, but held at bay by the sheer volume of color and purpose. He was creating a world both on canvas and in reality, and in the fierce Provençal light, it seemed possible that this world could sustain him and others. He painted the café terrace at night, capturing the gaslight's halo against the deep cobalt sky, a testament to the enchantment he found in his new home. It was a dream, solid as the yellow plaster on the walls, vivid as the paint on his palette, and as fragile as a sunflower stem in a jug of water, drinking deeply of the light while it lasted. The arrival was an event long imagined, a cornerstone of the dream. Paul Gauguin stepped off the Arles coach on a blustery October day, a figure of imposing solidity amidst the swirling dust. He carried with him the aura of the tropics and the Parisian avant-garde, his gaze assessing, his demeanor coolly self-possessed. Vincent, waiting with a nervous, boyish eagerness, saw not just a fellow painter, but the savior of the studio of the South. He had prepared for months, painting the sunflowers, furnishing the guest room, meticulously budgeting Theo's francs to support them both. The initial days held a fragile, hopeful camaraderie. They set up their easels side by side in the small studio on the upper floor, the light from the large window bathing their canvases. They painted the same subject, the Alice camps, the ancient Roman necropolis, their contrasting visions, a source of lively if pointed debate. Vincent worked with feverish speed, laying on thick, directional strokes, trying to capture the very vibration of the autumn air among the sarcophagi. Gauguin worked slowly, methodically, his brushstrokes more controlled, his colors more calculated, building the scene with a deliberate synthetic harmony. Vincent watched, fascinated and intimidated. The first fissures appeared in their discussions, which soon hardened into ideological clashes. Gauguin, weary of the empirical, championed painting from memory and imagination. Art, he argued, should not copy nature, but synthesize it, distilling it into symbolic forms and flat, decorative color. Vincent, for all his recent liberation of palette, remained rooted in the tangible. His art was an act of confrontation, of wresting truth directly from the motif before him. The gnarled vine, the plowed field, the face of the postman Rulin. He believed in the sanctity of the thing itself, felt in paint. Gogh found this approach naive, a servitude to the accidental. Vincent found Gogh's theories cold, an abandonment of the world's living pulse. Their debates over the dinner table, fueled by cheap wine and Vincent's strong coffee, grew increasingly charged. Gogh's critiques of Vincent's work were delivered with a condescending certainty that stripped the paint from the canvas, leaving only perceived faults of composition and haste. Vincent, desperate for the approval of this man he so admired, absorbed each comment like a physical blow, then defended his methods with a trembling, verbose intensity that only widened the gap. Vincent's agitation grew, a visible vibration in his hands and a restless pacing that filled the small rooms. He became a mirror to Gogh's moods, his own happiness rising and falling with his guests' taciturn expressions. Every mention of Paris, every sigh of dissatisfaction from Gogh was interpreted as a prelude to departure, a prospect that filled Vincent with a terror so profound it choked him. The yellow house, once a vessel of light, began to feel like a pressure cooker. Gogh took to walking the town alone for hours, escaping the claustrophobic intensity of Vincent's neediness. Vincent, left behind, would stare at the empty chair, the unfinished chess game, and feel the dream curdling around him. He began to paint at night, a desperate, furious productivity under the hissing gas lamps. He painted the empty chair where Gogh sat, a more elegant carved chair holding a burning candle and 2 modern novels. He painted his own simple rush-seated chair, empty save for his pipe and a pouch of tobacco. The paintings were silent, potent portraits of absence, of a fellowship already ghostly. The atmosphere in the yellow house grew thick and oppressive, a palpable fog of creative tension and unspoken resentment. The brilliant southern light outside seemed to mock the gloom within. Vincent's letters to Theo became frantic, oscillating between praise for Gogh's genius and terrified whispers of his own instability. He painted Gogh as he painted the sunflowers, as a subject of intense study, capturing the other man's hooded, inscrutable gaze in a portrait that seemed to probe for a soul it could not find. Gogh, in turn, painted Vincent at work on his sunflowers, depicting him as a man possessed, a fanatic lost in his own frenzy. They were each capturing a truth about the other, and neither liked the reflection. The initial hope of a collaborative paradise had soured into a tense, unsustainable coexistence. Vincent, sensing the inevitable collapse, worked ever faster as if he could paint a barrier against the coming storm, his nocturnal sessions stretching toward dawn. The only sound the frantic scrape of his brush and the low, constant hum of his own escalating dread. A man feverishly decorating a house he could feel crumbling beneath his feet. The final argument did not explode. It detonated in a silence more violent than any shout. It was the evening of December 23rd. The mistral had been howling for days, scraping at the shutters, fraying nerves already worn to filaments. Inside the yellow house, the air was stale with tobacco smoke and unresolved tension. Gogh announced his intention to leave. His voice flat and final, he was returning to Paris. The studio of the South was a fantasy, and he would no longer be its prisoner. Vincent's pleas were a torrent of desperation, promises to change, to be quieter, to paint differently, appeals to brotherhood, to their shared artistic mission. Gogh listened with the impassive patience of a man waiting for a train, his packed bag by the door a mute rebuttal. To every word, something in Vincent's mind, strained beyond its tensile limit by months of hope and fear, finally snapped. The world did not shatter into pieces. It folded inwards, collapsing into a single searing point of unbearable pressure behind his eyes. Gogh, seeing the terrifying vacancy that replaced Vincent's frantic emotion, turned and walked out into the windy Arles night, his footsteps echoing away down the cobbled lane. Alone in the yellow silence, Vincent was adrift in a psychic tempest. The rational world had dissolved. Visions, voices, and a cacophony of colors swirled in the void where his thoughts had been. A profound, distorted logic emerged from the chaos. An eye had seen too much, had witnessed the dream's dissolution. An ear had heard the final, irrevocable rejection. The offending organ must be removed. In the small, cluttered downstairs room, under the grim glow of the gas lamp, he took the straight razor. The act was not one of wild frenzy, but of eerie, ceremonial precision. There was a flash of pain, astonishing in its clarity, and then a warm, pulsing cascade down the side of his neck. He stood, swaying slightly, regarding the fragment of flesh in his hand with a detached curiosity as if it were a curious seashell, or a piece of unusual fruit. The blood was a startling, vibrant red against his pale skin, a color more vivid than any on his palate. He staggered to the basin, wrapping the ear in a piece of newspaper with the meticulous care of a grocer packaging a delicate purchase. He bound his own head with a rough bandage, the white cloth already blooming a sinister rose. The imperative now was delivery. Clutching the small parcel, he left the yellow house, moving through the darkened streets like a somnambulist. His destination was a familiar brothel on the Rue du Bout d'Arles, a place he had occasionally visited for company. He asked for a prostitute named Rachel, a girl of cheerful disposition. When she appeared, he presented her with the newspaper package, a gift, he murmured, to keep carefully. His words were slurred, his eyes glazed. She accepted it with a laugh, thinking it an odd bit of food or a trinket, before the spreading stain on his bandage and the pallor of his face registered. Her scream echoed in the tiled hallway as he turned and stumbled back out into the night. He managed to navigate the labyrinth of streets back to the Place Lamartine, back to the green door. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom, leaving a trail of dark droplets on the wooden steps. He collapsed onto his bed, the world narrowing to a throbbing tunnel. The last thing he saw was the painting of his bedroom on the wall opposite. That idealized vision of peace and order, now watching over him with cruel, silent irony. The bandage soaked through, a deep crimson spreading across the pillow. Outside, the mistral continued to keen, scouring the empty square. The yellow house stood silent, its dream extinguished, its only occupant bleeding into unconsciousness as the long night wore on. He was found the next morning by the police, alerted by the horrified Rachel. They forced the door and discovered him in his blood-soaked bed, alive but deeply unconscious, his breathing shallow. The room was cold. On the floor lay the razor, cleaned and placed neatly aside. Sunlight, that brilliant Provençal sunlight he had crossed a continent to find, streamed mercilessly through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing above the wreckage of his hope. It fell upon the bandaged head, the peaceful ashen face, and upon the vibrant accusing yellows of the sunflower canvases stacked against the wall. A chorus of silent, blazing witnesses to the shattered dream. The artist's colony was over before it had truly begun. The guest was gone, fleeing north. The host remained, broken and alone, his sanctuary now a crime scene, his great vision dissolved into a pool of blood on a pillow under the relentless, indifferent southern sun. The high stone walls of St. Paul de Mosel did not keep the world out. They sealed a world within. For Vincent, the asylum outside St. Remy was less a hospital than a new kind of studio, its boundaries strictly defined, its light filtered through the bars of a former monk's cell. His room on the second floor was spare, an iron bedstead, a wooden chair, a small table. The window looked down into the heart of his new universe, the walled garden. Admission had been his own decision. A terrified bargain struck after the catastrophe in Arles. In exchange for his freedom, he received a grim, predictable routine. Meals at regimented hours, the occasional lukewarm bath, the distant sounds of other inmates' cries echoing through the tiled corridors. It was a life reduced to its barest rhythms, a forced calm that felt like holding one's breath underwater. Between the crises, the attacks that descended without warning, this garden became everything. When the doctors permitted it, he would carry his easel, his canvas, and his wooden paint box down the narrow stairs and into the open air. The garden was not manicured for beauty, but was a practical, somewhat neglected plot divided by straight paths. Yet to Vincent's eye, it was a cosmos. In the spring, a tumult of life erupted from the dark earth. The irises came first, spearing up with a violent, regal purple, their petals like crumpled velvet. He painted them not as delicate flowers, but as torches burning against the rich red-brown soil, their green leaves swords of pure energy. He worked with a speed that bordered on panic, as if the vision might be snatched away by the next onset of dizziness or the phantom voices that whispered from the oleander bushes. The attacks were the price for these lucid intervals. They arrived like a change in atmospheric pressure, a thickening of the air before a storm. The world would warp, the straight cypress trees at the garden's edge beginning to writhe like dark flames, the sky pulsing with a sickly greenish hue. Tinnitus screamed in his ears, drowning out the real sounds of bees and birds. Sometimes he would lose consciousness, waking hours later in his cell, disoriented and weak. Other times he was gripped by a paralyzing terror or a fit of uncontrollable agitation. The medical men called it epilepsy, a madness of the nerves. Vincent called it the storm within. Each episode left him drained, his hands trembling, his thoughts scattered. But in the exhausted calm that followed, the desire to paint returned with a sharper, more desperate focus. The garden was his anchor, the one fixed point in a sea of internal chaos. He turned his brush on the lilacs, their heavy clusters a more subdued violet than the irises, smelling of a sweetness that almost hurt. He painted them cascading over a wall, their form less important than their essence, a fragrant, trembling mass. He painted the soaring cypress trees that lined the property's boundary, seeing in them not mere trees but great black-green geysers, erupting from the earth, twisting upwards towards the Provençal sky. With an almost painful aspiration, their forms began to swirl in his paint, their contours losing botanical accuracy to become expressions of a vast surging energy. The garden walls, which to another might signify confinement, to him became a frame. Within it, every blade of grass, every clump of weeds, every stone was charged with a fierce, vibrating life. He was not depicting a sanitized retreat, but a nature that was itself a little mad, gloriously overgrown, teeming with a fertility that mirrored his own frenzied creativity. His palette once again underwent a transformation. The joyous, clear yellows of aureoles were tempered with the strident blues and violets of the iris beds, the ominous greens of the cypresses, the soothing mauves of the lilacs. He applied the paint thickly, with curving, impassioned strokes that followed the growth of the plants and the swirl of the clouds. The garden under his brush became a place of beautiful turmoil, a sanctuary that was also a battlefield where light wrestled with shadow, where order in the straight paths was constantly subverted by the wild, curling vitality of the growth. In these canvases, painted between spells of haunting fear, Vincent found a paradoxical freedom. The asylum walls held his body, but in the garden, with its swirling cypresses and erupting flowers, his spirit could rage and exult, transforming his prison into a place of terrible freedom. Swirling beauty, a testament painted not in spite of his suffering but directly through its fractured, magnificent lens. The letter arrived on a day of deceptive calm. The Provençal sun baked the stone walls of the garden, and the cicadas sawed their monotonous song. Vincent sat on a bench, sketching the twisted trunk of an ancient pine, when one of the attendants brought the envelope, Theo's handwriting familiar and steady. He broke the seal with thick, paint-stained fingers. The news within was simple, momentous. A son. Johanna had given birth. A healthy boy, they had named him Vincent Willem van Gogh. For a long moment, he simply stared at the words, the letters swimming. A profound, shuddering joy rose in his chest, warm and expansive as the sunlight. A child, a nephew, carrying his name into a future he would never see. It was a thread of continuity, a fragile bridge across the abyss of his own fractured life. He imagined Theo's face, the quiet pride, the domestic happiness that had always seemed so foreign, so unattainable to Vincent himself. He felt a surge of pure, uncomplicated love for his brother, a gratitude so vast it ached. Then the other wave hit cold and dark, pulling him under. The name Vincent. They had bestowed his cursed, troublesome name upon an innocent child. What were they thinking? His name was synonymous with failure, with scandal, with madness. A burden, not a blessing. He saw his own life, the dismissed preacher, the disgraced lover, the penniless dependent, the mutilated lunatic. Was that the legacy this child would inherit? The joy curdled into a sharp, acidic shame. He was unworthy. He had contributed nothing but worry and expense, a permanent shadow on Theo's stability. This act of naming felt less like an honor and more like a terrifying act of faith in him, a faith he knew to be misplaced. He was a broken vessel. They were pouring hope into him, and it would only leak out, staining everything. That night, the conflict between the soaring joy and the crushing unworthiness sought an outlet. It demanded a canvas. He did not paint the garden. He turned instead to the view from the barred window of his cell, a vista he had studied through iron lattice work many times. The village of Saint Remy lay sleeping below, its roof simple blocks of indigo. Above it, the sky was not empty. It was a churning cosmic sea. He began to paint, not the sky as it was, but as he felt it, a vast, swirling vortex of ultramarine and cobalt, alive with pulsating stars that were not points of light, but great, burning whirlpools of white and yellow, each surrounded by halos of frantic energy. The moon was a pale crescent furnace. In the foreground, dominating the left side of the canvas, he placed the dark, surging form of a cypress tree, its shape echoing the swirling skies, a black flame connecting the earthly village to the celestial tumult. It was a vision of both sublime solace and profound turmoil. The village slept in peaceful ignorance. The heavens roared with a beautiful, terrifying life. It was a portrait of the cosmos as he experienced his own mind, a place of magnificent, chaotic creation and deep, isolating vastness. He called it the Starry Night. In the days that followed, a strange lucidity descended. The painting of the violent sky seemed to have purged something. The internal storms quieted. The world regained its solidity. The cypresses in the garden stood still, merely trees. He felt a clear, convincing certainty. He was cured. The asylum had served its purpose. The cycles of attack and recovery, he reasoned, were over. He was ready to re-enter the world, to be an uncle, to paint without the specter of confinement. He requested an audience with the director. He spoke calmly, logically of his improved state, of his brother's new responsibilities, of his own desire to be closer to family, to be useful. He presented himself not as a supplicant, but as a man who had passed through fire and emerged, scarred but whole. The director, perhaps swayed by this period of stability, or by Vincent's earnest conviction, agreed to consider a discharge. Hope, fragile and fierce, bloomed in Vincent's chest, a feeling brighter than any star he had painted. He began to pack his few belongings, his paints, his canvases. He looked at the stone walls, the barred window, not as a prison anymore, but as a place he was leaving behind. He was Vincent van Gogh, artist, soon to be free. The garden, with its irises and cypresses, became just a garden again. The future, for the first time in a year, held a door, and it was opening. He believed utterly that he was stepping through it healed. The village of Villers-sur-Oise, nestled in a bend of the river north of Paris, was a place of soft contours and drowsy charm. To Vincent, arriving in the late spring of 1890, it felt like a gentle sigh after the stony rigor of the asylum. Dr. Paul Gogh, the homeopathic physician and amateur etcher Theo had entrusted with his care, lived in a house on the hill. The doctor was a melancholic soul himself, with a deep appreciation for art and a collection of impressionist works. He prescribed rest, good food, and the freedom to paint. For a few precious weeks, it seemed a perfect final arrangement. Vincent took a small attic room at the Auberge Revue, his window overlooking the tiled roofs and the distant rolling fields. The internal storms had quieted. The world held its shape. He felt, if not peace, then a fragile truce. What followed was a final, stunning eruption of creativity, a volcanic outpouring that defied his own fragile state. In 70 days he produced over 70 paintings, a pace of manic fecundity that eclipsed even his Arles period. It was as if all the accumulated visions of his life, the somber dignity of Noonan, the fractured light of Paris, the swirling skies of Saint-Rémy, were now being filtered through a lens of urgent, summarizing clarity. He painted the thatched roofs of the village cottages, their angles sharp against the hills, the textures rendered with thick, rhythmic strokes of orange and brown. He painted Doctor's self. Gotched's garden, the doctor himself portrayed with a head propped wearily on a hand, a foxglove plant on the table, the expression one of profound, shared melancholy. He painted the church at Alvars, its violet shadows stretching across the sun-baked square, the building seeming to writhe against a sky of swirling electric blue. Each canvas was completed in a single intense session, as if he were transcribing visions that would not wait. But the wheat fields were his primary obsession. He returned to them day after day, under skies that could turn from serene azure to brooding indigo in an hour. He painted them vast and expansive, the golden stalks alive with a restless, whispering energy, paths cutting through them leading to nowhere. He painted them under threatening skies, the dark blues and greens of the heavens pressing down upon the vibrant gold, creating a tension that was both beautiful and ominous. In these fields he found his ultimate subject, the cycle of life, growth, and reaping. The wheat was ripe, heavy-headed, ready for the scythe. It was a metaphor that pulsed in every brushstroke, a glorious, abundant culmination that preceded the inevitable cut. The despair crept back, not with a dramatic crash, but with the slow, cold seep of financial reality. Letters from Theo, always supportive, began to carry a new, strained undertone. Theo's own position at the gallery was insecure. His health was poor. The costs of his new family and his brother's upkeep were a grinding burden. Vincent, hypersensitive to any hint of strain, read between the lines. The old gnawing conviction returned, colder and harder than ever. He was a permanent drain, a failure whose only product was unsellable canvases that filled storerooms. The brief hope of cure and contribution curdled into the certainty of eternal liability. The vibrant paintings he produced in overs were not a path to independence. They were simply more evidence of his costly, unproductive frenzy. Gauch's well-meaning care felt like another charity. The attic room was not a studio, but another rented cell in a life of dependency. On July 27th, a day of thick, humid heat, he took his painting gear and walked to a wheat field above the village. He worked for a time, adding to a canvas of the vast rolling fields under a dark, spreading sky. Then he set his materials aside. The afternoon stretched, heavy and silent. The golden wheat, so often a symbol of life in his work, now spoke only of conclusion. Here, in the open under the wide sky, the arithmetic of his existence became unbearably simple. He was a burden whose removal would be a final gift, the only valuable thing he could offer. He took out a revolver he had borrowed, ostensibly to scare away crows. The report was a small, flat sound, swallowed by the immense landscape. The bullet entered his lower chest. He stumbled but did not fall immediately. He managed to gather his painting gear and walk the long mile back to the auberge, up the narrow stairs to his attic. When the innkeeper, Ravu, checked on him that evening, he found Vincent lying on his bed, blood soaking his shirt, smoking his pipe. "I have wounded myself," he said quietly. For 2 days he lingered in the small room, a slow, painful ebbing. Theo, summoned by telegram, arrived in haste. There was no surgery to perform. The bullet was lodged too deep. The brothers were together in the cramped attic, the smell of oil paint and blood in the paw. Ere they talked, as they always had, of art, of home, of the fields. Vincent expressed no regret, only sorrow for the trouble he caused. His final words, as reported, were, "The sadness will last forever." He died in the early morning of July 29th, with Theo holding him, the sunlight just beginning to touch the tiles of the roofs outside the window he had painted with such fervent love. In the room below, his last canvas of the wheat field, leaned against a wall, the dark sky and golden stalks a final unresolved chord of beauty and despair. A field forever waiting for a reaper who had finally turned the scythe upon himself. Theo van Gogh died in Utrecht 6 months later, his body and mind broken by syphilis, in a grief so profound it functioned as a solvent, dissolving his own will to live. The brothers were buried side by side in the cemetery at Alvers, 2 simple stone markers amidst the grass, a final quiet proximity after a lifetime of separation bridged only by letters and love. The weight of what remained, the unsold paintings, the stacks of correspondence, the legacy of a silenced voice, fell upon slender, unexpected shoulders, those of Johanna van Gogh Bonger, Theo's widow. Johanna was 28, left with an infant son named Vincent, and an apartment in Paris filled with the physical residue of a brother-in-law she had met only a handful of times. The residue was overwhelming. Hundreds of canvases rolled and stacked in a spare room, under the bed, in the closet. They were vibrant, unsettling, and entirely without commercial value. Understeadling, and entirely without commercial value. Dealers shook their heads. The few who remembered Vincent recalled only the rumors, the ear, the madness, the crude technique. But Johanna, sorting through Theo's meticulous letters, found a different man, a passionate, lucid thinker, a devoted artist, a soul of immense sensitivity. She made it her mission to let the world see him through his work, as Theo had seen him. It was an act of love for her husband as much as for the artist. She began slowly organizing small exhibitions in her apartment, inviting critics and fellow artists. The reactions were mixed, often baffled. The paintings were too bright, too emotional, too raw. They violated every rule of taste. But a few eyes saw something else. In 1901, a major exhibition in Paris featured 71 of Vincent's works. Visitors walked through rooms pulsating with color, the blazing yellows of Arles, the swirling blues of Saint Remy, the ominous golds of Alvers. They stood before the starry night, its cosmic whirlpool both beautiful and terrifying, and before the sunflowers which seemed to generate their own light. The paintings did not merely hang on the walls. They vibrated, hummed with a life that made the more conventional art around them seem like wallpaper. A slow, posthumous dawning began. Johanna worked tirelessly, editing and publishing the letters between Vincent and Theo, providing a narrative framework for the explosive visual language. The world read of the struggles, the dreams, the unwavering fraternal support. The myth and the man began to merge. But now the madness was contextualized as the furnace of genius, the poverty as noble sacrifice. By 1914, with a major retrospective in Amsterdam, Vincent van Gogh was no longer a footnote of scandal but a central figure in modern art. Was no longer a footnote of scandal but a central figure in modern art. His influence seeped into the work of the Fauves, the German expressionists, who found in his emotional honesty and liberated color a permission slip for their own revolutions. Yet this burgeoning fame existed in a haunting counterpoint to the places that had birthed it. The Yellow House in Arles, badly damaged by Allied bombing in 1944, stood as a shell, its iconic color faded to a sickly mustard, the interior echoing with the ghosts of a shattered dream. The asylum garden at Saint Remy remained, the irises and cypresses still growing, oblivious to the millions who now gazed at their swirling representations. And in Auvers, the wheat field above the village still turned gold each summer, the same immense sky arching over it. But the path Vincent walked on his last day was just a path through grass. His grave next to Theo's was a simple slab, often adorned with fresh sunflowers left by pilgrims, a splash of vibrant living color against the gray stone, a silent dialogue between the man's obscurity and his posthumous radiance. The legacy was one of profound absence filled with overwhelming presence. The galleries and museums now throbbed with the life he had poured onto canvas, a life he himself could never grasp. The world finally heard the voice he had been certain was always shouting into a void. It was a tragic irony, but also a testament to the strange alchemy of art, that such profound loneliness could generate such a powerful sense of shared human feeling. Vincent van Gogh, who sold perhaps one painting in his lifetime, had posthumously painted the world in new colors, teaching it to see turmoil as beauty, despair as creative force, and a simple sunflower as a fragment of the divine blazing sun. The silence of the empty places was forever filled by the roaring, magnificent, and enduring noise of his art.